At 4:11 a.m. in Miami, the air near the river smelled like diesel, salt, warm concrete, and stormwater baked into the city. The neon signs were still glowing over bars that had just closed. Street sweepers dragged wet lines through empty intersections. A distant siren echoed between glass towers. At the same moment, hundreds of miles away in Minneapolis-St. Paul, cold mist sat low over loading bays and industrial parks. Sodium lights spilled across frozen pavement. Box trucks hummed in dark lots. The streets were dead quiet, the kind of quiet that feels staged, like the city itself knows something violent is about to happen. Then everything moved at once. FBI, DEA, ICE, DHS support teams, SWAT stacks in black armor, unmarked vehicles cutting their lights half a block from target sites. In Miami-Dade, and agents hit a bonded warehouse fronting as a tropical produce importer, a nightclub with an accounting room hidden under the VIP floor, 2 stash condos facing Biscayne Bay, a Hialeah auto yard used to rework hidden compartments, and a migrant smuggling transit house disguised as a family services office. In Minnesota, tactical teams rolled on a shipping intermediary in Eagan, a suburban safehouse in Richfield, a distribution warehouse in Burnsville, a counterfeit nonprofit office in St. Paul, and a truck dispatch center south of Minneapolis that investigators believed was routing narcotics, human trafficking debt collections, and cash transfers across the Midwest. It was not one raid. It was a rupture. Steel doors blew inward. Flashbangs turned dark rooms white. Agents shouted commands over crashing glass and barking dogs. One suspect in Doral ran through a side alley dragging a duffel bag stuffed with currency bricks until the zipper split and cash spilled across wet pavement. In St. Paul, 2 men tried to torch a ledger room before they were dragged out coughing through chemical smoke. In Miami, armed guards inside a cold storage facility fired from behind stacked pallets of fake seafood containers before SWAT teams flanked them through an adjoining loading lane. In Burnsville, an MS-13 lieutenant tried to ram a gate truck through a police barrier and got pinned between armored vehicles before he reached the service road. And then the numbers started climbing. In South Florida, agents found 1.3 million fentanyl pills hidden inside refrigeration units, 286 kilos of cocaine sealed in chemical drums, 94 kilos of heroin pressed into machinery casings, and more than 420 kilos of methamphetamine staged for northbound transfer. In Minnesota, they recovered additional fentanyl powder, meth bricks, heroin bundles, bulk cash, illegal firearms, suppressors, ghost phones, forged IDs, and coded payroll sheets listing names beside route assignments, safehouse addresses, and intimidation tasks. At one Hialeah site, the evidence team counted $11.6 million in shrink-wrapped currency before sunrise. At a suburban property near Woodbury, agents pulled steel cases from beneath a false basement floor containing passports, immigration, fraud packets, debt books, and lists of women and minors tied to trafficking lanes that stretched from Florida through the Midwest. If you are still imagining a simple gang roundup, you are not seeing it clearly enough. Because the first raid wave ended with something far more dangerous than narcotics. At a warehouse just outside Minneapolis, behind shelving labeled with cleaning products and freight tags, agents found a sealed caged room holding hardened laptops, encrypted drives, satellite devices, and 4 steel lockboxes marked only by dates. In Miami, in a riverfront office above a nightclub, they uncovered a wall safe containing ledgers, campaign donation matrices, inspection schedules, and a list of protected corridors identified by color codes. One federal supervisor reportedly glanced at the documents, then at the seized devices, and said the sentence nobody in the room wanted to hear. "This isn't protection," he said. "This is administration." By 9:22 a.m., the operation moved from sirens and breaching tools to fluorescent light and silence. Inside a federal cyber forensics center, analysts from the FBI and partner task forces sat in front of cloned drives and reconstructed data trees while coffee went cold on their desks. Outside, Miami was bright and humid. St. Paul was gray and freezing. Inside the lab, both cities disappeared into the same screen glow. The first decrypted file set opened like a trap door. It revealed a network map so large that analysts had to split it across multiple displays. Freight firms in Florida. Ghost corporations in Delaware. Truck brokers in Minnesota. Sham charities in both states. Restaurant chains used for cash washing. Recovery ministries that existed mostly on paper. Import-export fronts. Warehouse leases. Fuel cards. Shell consulting firms. Property holding companies. Offshore accounts. Digital wallets. Payment corridors running through Panama, Belize, Mexico, and back into the United States. At the center of the entire architecture was a project label that appeared in transport directives, extortion records, stash house rotations, enforcement orders, and encrypted authorization chains. Operation Iron Meridian. That was the name of the machine in this fictional story. Iron Meridian was not just an MS-13 sweep target. It was a trans-regional criminal design built to merge gang violence with cartel-linked supply chains, administrative concealment, and political shielding. The analysts saw how it worked. South Florida served as the warm water intake point. Miami-Dade warehouses, trucking yards, port-linked intermediaries, and corruption channels received narcotics and cash. From there, selected loads moved inland under legitimate commercial cover, breaking into two arteries. One ran north along the east coast. The other bent west and then up through interstate freight lanes toward the Midwest, where Minnesota's rail access, cold storage facilities, and low-profile industrial belts allowed product to be broken down, repackaged, and redistributed. Then they found the signature. It was not dramatic. Not some handwritten confession. It was colder than that. A repeating digital authorization key embedded inside route changes, inspection suppressions, emergency convoy diversions, and priority movement notices for certain shipments. The same key appeared in orders connected to narcotics transfers, migrant smuggling logistics, human trafficking debt management, and violent retaliation assignments against defectors. Again and again, the trail came back to one man, Cassian Vale. Publicly, in this fictional dramatization, Cassian Vale was an interstate logistics strategist, donor, transport consultant, and political fixer who moved comfortably between Miami finance circles and Minnesota infrastructure boards. He funded civic projects, appeared at shipping conferences, sat on regional freight panels, spoke in polished language about supply chain resilience and interstate commerce. Privately, according to the files emerging from Iron Meridian, he was the central coordinator who turned MS-13 from a scattered violent network into a disciplined enforcement arm attached to a cartel-linked trafficking machine. He did not just work around the system, he redesigned parts of it to serve the criminal network. One analyst stared at the screen for several seconds before saying, almost to herself, "This is not negligence, it is engineered treason." And then came the evidence that made the room go still. Cassian Vale's authorization key was tied not only to commercial routing, but to soft checkpoint timing, patrol thinning, warehouse zoning approvals, false nonprofit clearances, and judicial delay strategies. He had a matrix of useful officials, compromised contractors, intimidated clerks, paid intermediaries, and dirty enforcers in both states. Some took money, some took favors, some took protection, some took silence. Together, they turned two distant regions into one covert criminal corridor. Miami was the intake valve, Minnesota was the redistribution hinge, and MS-13, backed by cartel-linked supply channels, he served as the muscle keeping everyone below the top obedient. If that sounds like ordinary corruption, it wasn't, because in one continuity file labeled Blue Winter, analysts found plans for media control, post-arrest substitution crews, burner identity reserves, emergency payrolls for compromised officials, and civic stabilization language for maintaining influence after public pressure. The organization did not expect to survive by staying lucky. It planned to survive by replacing every damaged part. And that was the moment federal command understood the truth. The first raids had only cut into the outer shell. At 3:58 a.m. the next morning, in a hardened command center outside Minneapolis with a mirrored operations link to South Florida, digital maps pulsed red across both states. Miami, Hialeah, Doral, Homestead, port corridors. Northbound freight lanes, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Eagan, Burnsville, Rochester, Mankato, rail transfer depots, storage parks, quiet suburban homes with ordinary fences hiding extraordinary records. The screens looked less like law enforcement mapping and more like an infected circulatory system. The mission order that followed was massive. More than 1,600 federal personnel, 58 SWAT and tactical teams, FBI financial crimes units, DEA narcotics squads, ICE transport interdiction groups, DHS aviation support, armored vehicles, drone overwatch in warehouse corridors, K-9 teams, asset forfeiture crews, digital evidence teams, mobile detention units, coordinated warrants across dozens of target zones, all timed to hit before the network could relocate money, hard drives, or people. Then the second wave crashed down. In Miami-Dade, federal agents raided a luxury marina office that turned out to be a command post for offshore account transfers and emergency vessel movements. In Hialeah, they hit a machine yard where trailers were fitted with hidden narcotics compartments. In Doral, a warehouse fronting as an electronics distributor concealed industrial pill presses, precursor chemicals, and over 2.1 million fentanyl pills boxed for inland routes. In Homestead, a produce transfer center held cocaine loads buried inside irrigation equipment. In a waterfront estate registered to a shell company, agents seized gold bars, passports, judicial contact sheets, and a server array backing up Iron Meridian's internal enforcement records. At the same time in Minnesota, agents stormed a warehouse belt in Burnsville and found methamphetamine conversion equipment, cash counters, and hard copy ledgers tying Midwest street crews to Florida dispatchers. In St. Paul, a nonprofit youth center existed mainly as a laundering valve for extortion income and narcotics cash. In Richfield, a quiet duplex served as a human trafficking holding site, complete with debt contracts, intimidation photos, and transport schedules. In Rochester, an agricultural logistics office concealed route overlays, prepaid devices, and convoy timing records, showing that shipments had been moving through rural lanes under cover of maintenance shutdowns and low-traffic windows. South of Mankato, a freight relay barn stored rifles, body armor, and backup communication hubs in case urban sites got burned. The operation moved so fast that large parts of the network never got a chance to react. One convoy tried to break north from South Florida and was boxed in before dawn. Another attempted to scatter cash through 3 suburban properties outside Minneapolis, but the warrants had already landed. A senior MS-13 enforcer in Miami tried to destroy a drive with a torch. Evidence teams stopped him with seconds left. A transport broker in Minnesota attempted to flee in a snowstorm using a farm route investigators already had flagged. He made it 10 miles. By noon, the fictional numbers were staggering. More than 2,400 arrests and detentions tied to the sweep. Hundreds of key warrants executed. Multi-ton seizures of narcotics across linked properties and transit nodes. Millions in physical cash. Hundreds of millions more in digital assets, shell holdings, real estate, and logistics infrastructure. Firearms. Communication hubs. Encrypted servers, extortion ledgers, trafficking records, protection payments, cartel-linked contact chains. The underworld had taken more damage in one operational window than it had in years, but the ugliest truth was still buried in the servers. Because once investigators began cross-referencing seized logs with patrol records, inspection schedules, administrative emails, and internal memos, they found the rot had spread farther than anyone wanted to admit. The network had not just bribed a few desperate people, it had cultivated a hidden service layer inside public systems. 28 law enforcement personnel, compliance officers, and public contractors across the 2 states were identified in the first review as compromised or under direct suspicion in this fictional story. Patrol shifts had been softened before convoy movement. Freight checks were delayed. Selected records disappeared. Inspection systems were reassigned. One county transport planner altered maintenance schedules, so key road monitoring tools were down when protected shipments passed. A deputy port compliance officer in Florida repeatedly downgraded risk scores for flagged container lots. A senior sergeant in Minnesota fed raid timing leaks through an intermediary who also handled gang payroll. A court clerk delayed warrants tied to specific stash houses. A zoning administrator pushed approvals for warehouse conversions that should have triggered deeper review. Several officers received tuition payments, debt relief, or disguised consulting fees routed through Vale's corporate fronts. That is when honest people inside the system began to understand how deep the betrayal really was. One veteran investigator stared at a wall of printed emails and payment chains and recognized names he had worked beside for years. Another officer in South Florida reportedly sat in silence after seeing a deputy chief's alias appear inside a convoy protection ledger. Men and women who wore the same uniforms, took the same oath, shook the same hands at funerals and retirement ceremonies. And all the while, in this fictional narrative, they had been feeding breath to a violent criminal system tied to fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, human trafficking, and migrant smuggling. This was no longer just infiltration. It was a second secret police layer, a parallel protection network, an administrative shield serving MS-13 and the cartel-linked pipeline behind it. Federal arrest teams moved with the same cold precision they used on the gang lieutenants. A senior sergeant was taken in cuffs from a county operations lot before sunrise. A deputy chief was arrested outside a public safety luncheon. A records manager collapsed into a chair when agents laid out the transfer chain that paid his mortgage. A transit contractor insisted he had only moved route data, nothing more, until investigators showed him overdose counts and shipment sequences tied to his adjustments. The emotional damage in those rooms was different from the violence of the raids. Less noise. More shame. One federal supervisor put it in terms nobody in the room forgot. "The badge survives," he said. "This version of the system does not." Then the map grew larger, because Iron Meridian did not end in Minnesota and Florida. It connected outward into a wider fictional corridor built on trucking contractors, shell fuel firms, agricultural routes, warehouse relays, private carriers, and controlled choke points. Some narcotics entered through South Florida commercial channels. Some arrived through cartel-linked inland partners. Some moved under refrigerated cover, some inside fabricated machinery, some through paperwork so ordinary nobody saw it twice. From there, loads fanned north, west, and inland. MS-13 crews handled intimidation, debt collection, territorial enforcement, and selected distribution, while higher-tier coordinators managed the logistics and the money. Analysts estimated the network could move multiple tons of narcotics per week, without triggering a full systems alarm if left undisturbed. Cocaine through freight corridors. Heroin and methamphetamine through smaller regional loads. Fentanyl pills hidden inside equipment, commercial goods, and package chains. Human trafficking and migrant smuggling lanes generated confusion, urgency, and political noise, consuming investigative resources while premium narcotics loads passed through cleaner channels. Shipping manifests were altered upstream. Way stations went dark for maintenance. Scanner windows were missed. Patrol grids softened. The whole thing had been redesigned for continuity. Then investigators opened the last catastrophic file, Meridian Covenant. It was less a criminal memo than a blueprint for permanence. Influence campaigns, charity fronts, property accumulation near freight lanes, judicial delay reserves, local patronage pipelines, transport board capture, civic donations used to launder reputation, emergency succession plans if Vale or senior coordinators were arrested. In plain language, the goal was chilling, not just to survive law enforcement, but to convert key regions into durable criminal habitats where public systems could be bent, slowly and quietly, toward cartel future use. That is the realization that should stay with you after a story like this. The most dangerous criminal network is not always the one that burns hottest in public. Sometimes it is the one that learns how to look respectable. Sometimes it hides behind freight software, grant language, zoning approvals, nonprofit brochures, campaign dinners, and polite corporate language about efficiency. Sometimes it does not need open violence every day. Sometimes it only needs silence, ambition, and enough compromised people telling themselves they are not responsible for where the road ends. But the road always ends somewhere. It ends in overdoses that turn bedrooms into crime scenes. In mothers and fathers identifying children lost to fentanyl. In neighborhoods fractured by cocaine, heroin, and meth. In trafficked women and minors treated like inventory. In migrants used as cover and discarded once they are no longer useful. In honest officers forced to learn that some of their own colleagues sold the public for tuition payments, mortgages, and quiet luxuries. In communities that only see the funeral, never the spreadsheet that made it possible. That is why this fictional dramatization matters as a warning, because power does not always wear a mask and carry a rifle. Sometimes power wears a clean suit. Signs a transport contract, hosts a charity dinner, funds a civic project, and quietly opens a lane for poison to move through the heart of the country. Sometimes organized crime does not conquer institutions from the outside. Sometimes it buys rooms inside them and waits.